I hope you can see us and hear us. This is Mary and Rob live in
Hello.
Southampton.
Yes.
And it's a
It's
very
shiny.
it's a
Yes.
very wet Southampton as well. So yes, we've been complaining about the rain. I hope it's nice and warm and sunny and not raining where you are. Thank you for joining us. I know that some people are viewing live. And we know that the time obviously doesn't fit in for other people. So you will be able to watch the recording when it is convenient for you.
Yes.
All right. We've had some lovely questions on the step. I don't know, is there anything in particular you'd like to begin with, Rob? You were talking about assessment, weren't you?
Yes. Well, I was thinking assessment is the large question to.
Yes, it's come up a lot, hasn't it?
Yes, and it's something to unpack quite a lot because we've got essentially assessment of English to access EMI. So should we be assessing?
And are we assessing the students or the teachers?
Exactly. So
who are we assessing and what are we assessing is the question.
So we had a number of questions around that, and they were very interesting questions.
Very, very good questions.
But my comment to Mary was, wow, this is going to take a long time to deconstruct and unpack. So maybe starting with EMI programs and questioning what we could do to okay, so we're just working out which camera to talk into. Now we've worked it out. It's this one.
This one here?
This one here.
Ah, right. Okay. Sorry.
Know your audience. Look them in the eye. Eye contact is important.
We're very amateurish, really, when it comes to technology.
We just
do
talk
our
about
best,
it. We don't.
Don't we?
We don't do what we tell you to do. So starting with the programs. I mean, one thing going back to week 1 and Mary's first video.
Hello,
is
Luciana.
EMI? You've also got to deal with interruptions.
Okay,
and,
the sound is a bit low,
knows?
but I don't know if it's just me.
Okay, maybe somebody else can comment and say whether they think the sound is low.
Yeah.
I can use my big voice for a while.
Your big voice.
That's my big voice.
Okay.
So I think the if we go back to week 1 and say EMI essentially involves input in English for students, and beyond that, there's a lot of variation in what it means in terms of how people assess how much English is actually around the course. Is the course, or are all the course materials in English, or is there a mixture of languages? There are a lot of questions in there that would influence the learning goals, the learning outcomes you're aiming for, which means that will have an implication for the assessment. I think good assessment practice in higher education is that you're essentially performance assessing what the learning outcomes of your module are. So I really think that, for example, I can take a good example, I think, is assessing someone who's going to become a counsellor and is learning psychotherapy, and they're going to be licensed with a qualification that allows them to practice in English. Their assessment should look fundamentally different from someone who's doing a master's degree in psychology, for which you're saying they know the area of psychology in a theoretical sense, where universities do they have diverse practices, and they give licenses to various people to do various things. And my key advice would really be that I think all modules and all programs have to performance assess their students, as in assess them in the kind of communication that the learning objectives require. Some of those might not require much English specifically, and the actual form of the English, the quality of the English is not of our concern whatsoever. But there are other fields where you might be giving a license to a pilot who's going to be operating in English, who perhaps can't speak in English. That's a problem.
Yes, exactly.
So again, it's contextual.
And hello to Luciana and Gabriella. Yes, Gabriella. It's nice to see people are actually able to join us live.
Yes.
Okay. Let's go through some of these questions.
I hope I'll be popular for mentioning UFMG today. like
Yes.
Mary was 2 weeks ago.
Okay. Are we going to move on to the assessing the practitioners of English? Because that was
We
a
can do,
question
sure.
from Gabriella, who's here with us now. One of the questions from Gabriella was, is there a basic level of proficiency required to be an EMI practitioner according to research? So I tried to dig out some research, and this is just one article, and this was by Robert O'Dowd, and it's just talking about European universities, the training and accreditation of teachers for English medium instruction, an overview of practice in European universities. So what I'll do is I'll put the reference on the step so that you can read it yourselves if you want to. But basically, at the end, he comes to, well, quite a few conclusions actually. Very wide range of levels of English expected of the practitioners in order to deliver in English. Some saying a B2 level, if we talk in terms of the Cambridge framework, the common framework. Things going from B2 through to C2. So there's an enormous range of what is expected of the practitioner in the different universities. But then, of course, they're not taking into account the actual subject matter that's being taught. And I would imagine that somebody delivering in, say, law, which for me seems, you know, quite a different language area, might need more proficiency, a higher proficiency in English than somebody doing another subject. So there's no, from what I can make out, no standard like you have to be a certain level in order to deliver through English. And certainly this was research from this was last year it was published. So it's reasonably up to date. The other things he says here, he mentions how EMI requires a significant shift in methodology. And so, you know, it comes back to that basic distinction once again. Are we talking about language? Are we talking about pedagogy? Are we talking about intercultural communication? You know, what are we talking about? And so I can't see that there's any way of, from a distance, saying that this is the standard. It seems to be something that has to be decided on a local level, you know, in the context that the people are operating in. Would you agree?
I would agree and say, yeah, it's essentially what I've read. I've read lots of research that says if you are not communicatively competent in English, the impact on staff and students, if you're asked to deliver EMI, can be devastating.
Yes.
You know, there have been real problems in some countries where they've simply implemented EMI. And Andy Kirkpatrick has been somebody who's been very critical of the Southeast Asian or some countries in Southeast Asia who've been very fast to introduce EMI without any infrastructure being there to actually deliver it, and the psychological strain, the emotional strain on staff and students, because university is obviously high impact. You know, that can be incredibly strong. But as Mary says, you can't put a broad number on it. Like, you have to be this level. And it links to Anna's question, who asked about.
And Anna's here.
Oh, is she?
Yeah. Hi,
Hello,
everyone.
Anna.
Hi, Anna. Yeah.
From South Africa. Welcome. I'm never sure what time it is in these places, but so that's great. So and thank you, Anna, for your contributions so far.
Yeah.
But Anna's question was about whether the measurement of English
4 p.m.
competence.
It's 4
Oh,
p.m.
thank you. 4 p.m. Okay, that's respectable.
Yes.
So would it look similar to IELTS? So would the measurement for EMI?
Oh, Maria Concepcion is. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Oh, that's okay. Don't worry.
I'm getting so excited.
You know, it's an intercultural situation. You have to be flexible. You have to adapt.
I know.
And Toluca. Greetings to Toluca.
Oh, from Toluca. Oh, we have many friends in Toluca, don't
yes,
we?
we do.
Yeah, please say hello to all of our friends in Toluca.
Yes. Yeah. So But I guess the question is, so would it look different to IELTS? Or from IELTS? I would say yes, it would. IELTS descriptors contain phrases like, you know, only makes the mistakes that native speakers would make.
Yes.
It's heavily based in a kind of game that if you do IELTS training, you go to your IELTS assessment, then it's quite accurate at assessing certain skills at a certain level. But these are not the skills of EMI. These are not the skills of lecturing. It's not no kind of performance assessment. And I used to be an IELTS marker. You used to be an I used to work under Mary as an IELTS.
Under me.
Yes.
Can you imagine?
Yes. You always good provided biscuits. So she was a good boss. But but yet you would end up marking people who misunderstood an instruction. So like it says summarize this table, and in the summary they offer a position or say this shows gender equality is not aligned in the United Kingdom, and that's not what IELTS means by summarize. So you knock them down. So it is playing a game, but it's not the game of teaching or delivering education through English. So absolutely it has to change. And areas like medicine are far more advanced in this area. And things like pilot training, you know, there are journal articles on performance assessing in these areas where they design, so they look at the CEFA, you know, the various scales of CEFA and say, what does this mean in this context? So what does it mean to be highly efficient as an English user for a pilot who wants to land a plane? What does it mean to be highly proficient as a doctor who's dealing interculturally with a patient with limited English ability? You know, these kind of skills are not, they're not the IELTS game. You have to play an assessment game, but it's not the IELTS game, and it's not based in one version of the language. It's it's not based on an easily quantifiable test that can go anywhere. It has to be specific. And to answer Anna's other question, would we have different assessments for different areas? I would say the ideal is yes.
Yes.
Or make the assessment adaptable. Because, yeah, as you said, someone with really good vocabulary and really good grounding in education within their subject area doesn't need so much other language to help them adapt to teaching through the language there. So they might be able to perform very effectively, but no assessment like IELTS is going to ask them, can you perform successfully in your teaching role? It's just going to say, can you talk about your favorite color and what it means in your culture? And this is not, it's a different area. So
completely different area. I just want to change the emphasis slightly to think about you personally, what your ambitions are for the future, because as you can gather from our discussion, we believe that assessment is something that takes place locally, and decisions about whether teacher, lecturer is equipped well enough to engage in EMI, whether students have enough language ability to engage in a course delivered through English. We believe that that is your responsibility. That's something that is managed locally, and you establish your own criteria, you know, whether we're talking about students or whether we're talking about practitioners. However, just to put the other side of the argument, I want to think about you as people with careers and people who may wish to travel to other countries and teach through the medium of English. And I think it would be wrong of us not to mention the fact that there are qualifications. Now, I'm not saying that I actually approve of them. I've got many question marks about them, but they exist. And I think it's part of our responsibility to point this out to you as well. There's the Cambridge Certificate in EMI Skills, which is an online course. There's also the TKT, is that Teacher's Knowledge Test? Something like that. We actually had a group of teachers from the University of Nizhny Novgorod a couple of years ago who came over here to prepare for the TKT exam with us. And that's a modular exam, and you can take it all over the world. Now, if you're thinking of moving, for career reasons or personal reasons to another country, then you may need something to show that you are able to deliver through the medium of English. You need something with portability. So I just want to mention that those two, I don't know if there are any others, there may be others, I don't know. They do exist. They don't carry the Mary blessing of approval, but they're out there.
That sounds like a certificate. Someone mentioned certification. I think.
Oh yeah, come on, let's read all this.
Sorry, hang on. I was going to say.
Yeah.
I wanted to come on to a couple of comments we've got.
Oh
here.
yes.
But just to mention, we've talked a couple of times about equality and equity in EMI. But the other thing that really should be mentioned here is that we're getting these questions from people who are based in countries where English is not used as a first language. If you've done your PhD in America, Australia, Britain, or another English-speaking country, that's a passport. That's treated like a qualification. Like, okay, now, you did it in Britain. In that case, you'll definitely be able to teach through the medium of English. And this is another area of inequality where, in some ways, I don't really approve of lots of the assessments that are rolled out on a large quantifiable scale. But this is an area of inequality which can exist. And I'd mention, it's because somebody here, was it Luciana, said she thinks it's a problem that certification doesn't exist because it can result. We know the outcomes when universities can employ people and not require any kind of certification.
Yes.
So there is another side to that. But I think the fact that EMI in universities, there's a potential that courses can be offered without full resources being given to support students and staff. That's a different problem from having a systematic kind of one-size-fits-all assessment of language that's going to fit EMI, like we talked about having the one methodology that everybody would use in EMI. That's a bigger danger for me. We can, as a community, we can tell our universities, hold on, you cannot deliver EMI clumsily. It could be in French, it could be in Spanish, whatever language it is. You can't internationalize in a clumsy way where people are not qualified to teach what they're teaching. But I think making that point is very different from saying we should give way to large-scale standardized testing. And to go for Anna's point, she said that medical and pilot training are more advanced because they are life and death situations. I think that's a good point, that some areas get more attention, more funding, and operate more effectively because of that reason. Yes. But I don't think it's a reason to ignore the complexities of what we do and how important performance is in our professions. But thank you. Sorry, Mary. Now you're going to, do you want to interact with some people?
Right. In Mexico, this is Maria Concepcion. We have Cambridge and I think TKT. Oh, Nina. Oh, hi, Nina. Hi, Nina.
In my notes.
But we received a transcript from a math class in our EMI training and it was an eye-opener. Numbers really did not play as important a role in the lecture as I expected. Yes. Even if the PhD has a degree in the UK, it doesn't necessarily mean they have the right know-how to teach in EMI settings, does it? No, exactly. That's just what
certainly doesn't know.
Rob was saying. Yes.
And that's it. I mean, if it were in this country or any other country, they go through a rigid interview process. They would be asked to deliver part of a class or do a presentation in English. They'd have questions and answers in front of a panel before they'd be put up as a teacher. And I think there are lots of shortcuts which need to be avoided.
And Anna is agreeing with Nina that engineering has complex language use, because Nina had talked about the misconception that hard science require a lower level of English. I think we've knocked that on the head very, very clearly, metaphorically, yes. very, very clearly.
Mm.
The other thing I wanted to mention, going back to the article that I was reading to try and answer that question about assessment and proficiency and so on. This article that I was reading talked about EMI and CLIL, and it reminded me to remind you what we said in the very, very first unit, that we are taking the word term CLIL in a very narrow sense to mean this dual teaching of English, teaching of a language, and the teaching of the content, for example, geography, together. And therefore, we associate it more with secondary school situations. Now, reading this article reminded me that, of course, there are other interpretations of CLIL. And the writer of this particular article uses the word CLIL really to mean interactive methodology rather than the teaching of a language. So if you are reading articles where the term CLIL pops up, I think it would be very helpful to get it clear in your mind what the writer understands by CLIL, what they're meaning by CLIL, because clearly here he means interactive activities in the classroom. He's talking about pedagogy, and he's talking about we need to have CLIL activities. Well, they're not CLIL activities, they're interactive activities, if you can say that. Interactive activities, a bit clumsy. But so that just reminded me to remind you of our interpretation, which is a decision that we find helpful for the purposes of this MOOC.
Thank you.
So that was just a little aside, but I wanted to make that
clear. We could
clear.
go back to the discussions. We've got Antonio, who said, I teach Air Force pilots and can testify that many of them are hardly proficient or are highly proficient users, like myself. They rely on a lot of standard radio phraseology.
Yes.
And that's a very interesting area.
Very interesting area. Yeah.
There is some research on both sides of this, because obviously if you train people who are pilots, you might be training them to do different things. So some of them might be reading manuals in English or communicating with engineers in English. Some of them might be doing a simple task of communication with ground control, in which case they have set phrases which they use. And the interesting research that we're aware of is often cited in English as a lingua franca fields, where actually it's the native speaker pilots who tend to break the code. So they tend to communicate. So they're going to land in Bangkok airport and they'll communicate freely. So, hi there, yeah, we're coming in to land, guys. And the people listening are thinking, what on earth did that person just say? Yes. What are they going to do? Because actually, by strict pilot code, as I understand it, I'm not a pilot myself, but they
not one of your many skills.
They have not one of my few skills. They so the ability to deliver particular lines to somebody who might have a very high proficiency in English or a very low one, you kind of want to stick to the script. And it's quite interesting that that's one of the areas where native speakers get in a lot of trouble, because they want to communicate. They've been in a plane for ages. They're thinking, oh, I need some interaction now, I'm going to land. And it's not particularly appreciated by people who can't understand what they're saying. So there are two sides to that, but absolutely it's, we don't want to label, as you said, with engineers, also medicine, various fields. You know, there is a lot of proficiency required and not always there. So we've got to be careful.
I'm listening to you and I'm trying to look at the responses. We've got like two conversations going on at the same time.
Of course.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Luciana, in an emergency, I would say proficiency is very important. And Nina reminding us about law. I find it very.
And actually flexibility of language.
Yes.
We talk a lot about flexibility of language. Law is really the one I think, the biggest field where they try to limit the flexibility of key words as much as possible.
They do, and
It's all about
yes,
definitions.
it's all about definitions, and even like the comma, the use of the comma is critical. So yeah, I kind of keep away from the law actually because I know that I really don't know enough about it. So anyway, we've got Nina here who is from Serbia. So please say hello to all of the people in Serbia that I met. And you asked for another example of a task that we did when we were together in Serbia. I haven't got a task that I can just, give you just like that. But it reminded me that I think all of us are linguists, applied linguists, etc. And we are able to deconstruct language. We look at language and we pull it apart, dismantle it, and so on. And it reminded me of a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who's an artist, who said, I can look at a painting and I can take it to pieces. I can deconstruct that painting. No, I can't do that. I just look at a painting and I think, that's lovely, I like it, or I don't like it, or the sky is blue. But I can't take it to pieces the way my friend can. So this is a little bit like us talking about language, which we can deconstruct. And we should always remember that our colleagues that we might be helping to teach through the medium of English are not necessarily able to deconstruct the language with the facility that we have. And it's easy to forget that because they don't possibly have, the lens that we have when we look at a piece of language. So they do need a lot of help in sorting out the different types of language and the functions and the effect. So when we did that exercise in Serbia, Nina, it reminded me of other exercises in general where we help people who are not linguists to look at the different chunks of language and really identify what we're doing with them. Because obviously we start with the language and then that gives you the base with which to deliver. And what are the bits of language doing? How communicative are these bits of language? Why has a person chosen to say something this way? So, for example, you've chosen all of these lovely, I'm losing my voice, videos that you recommend to one another. It's helpful if you can show a good video to somebody and then analyze it in simple terms with the non-linguists to try and put simple labels on what they're doing. And I think this is as helpful as anything, because I have met, wonderfully, really fantastic EMI teachers, nothing to do with language, people are scientists and so on, but they can't really pull apart the language. It's just a stream of consciousness to them. So I think any activity, whether it's on paper or whether it's oral, like that, is helpful. Excuse me, you take over for me for a moment.
I will take over.
Excuse me.
Luckily, we don't have our microphones on today.
What a good thing.
Yes, I think it's a very good point, and I'll just add to that. I'm a big admirer of Roy Harris, who's a famous linguist from. I like people who read aloud.
Sorry. Yes, Nina, I will be in touch.
Hello, Nina. Nice to meet you. So what I liked about Roy Harris was his counterpoint to your point. Not that it's arguing against, because I think you're certainly right, but also that linguists have to be humble and recognize the expertise that other people have who look at language in a different way. And Roy Harris, he was chair of linguistics at Oxford, but he said, you know, when he meets a bus driver, he doesn't necessarily have a great, or Roy Harris, the linguist, doesn't necessarily have a greater grasp of language as a linguist for the purpose of driving a bus. So the bus driver is a more expert user of language for what he does. And on that level, we need both sides. So we need to bring our expertise as linguists, help people to see the language part, but we absolutely cannot obscure or gloss over the expertise that they have and might not recognize that they have in delivering their own subject, communicating with their own tribe. I like that book, Academic Tribes and Territories, to talk about how different disciplines have different cultures and different ways of communicating, different ways of relating, and different hierarchies. And I think there's some truth in that. So I think the knowledge that somebody has, let's say as an engineer who's going to communicate with an audience of engineers, there's something there that they have that I would not have as somebody who could teach them to take apart the language, but I wouldn't be able to construct the meaning that they would want to deliver for their audience. So I think that's the other side of a very, very, very difficult puzzle to put together. But yeah, I think if you can balance those two, you have an excellent EMI program.
I think so. I mean, humility is something that we should all, you know, bear in mind in working with whoever it is, and in all our sort of like social engagements and everything that we do. We, you know, and being linguists, we sometimes have this kind of, not exactly superiority, but you know, we know what you're doing with language, kind of thing, you know, and we can. So I think that's a very good point about humility. One way in which, although it's not possible for everybody, but one way that you can come together and help people is, of course, if you have any kind of a way of buddying up at all with somebody who's learning to deliver through the medium of English and perhaps needs a little bit of support. If somebody who has the expertise in engineering can come together with you, who has the expertise in using language, together, then you're in a wonderful position to move forward, and both people learn from the exchange. That's quite a costly in terms of term and time and maybe, you know, the financial aspect. It is quite costly, but that is an effective way of moving forward and helping people. Because I think the people that we're talking to today are particularly interested in training others. I mean, it strikes me that we have, in this particular run, yes, we have people who are approaching EMI for the first time, but we also have a lot of people who are in the situation of wanting to lead and pass on EMI knowledge. So, you know, to try and think of a few solutions, possible or not, to put forward and discuss to the people in the group that are engaged in teacher training is an important part, I feel, of our discussion today.
Yeah.
You know, ways forward.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say, yeah, we've got a few comments. So if we go in chronological order, so I was smiling a little bit because it's becoming an interesting conversation.
Wow,
in
Antonio.
But yeah, Nina mentioned it's gone, you can't see it anymore.
I can't see it now.
But Nina mentioned it would be useful to have some methods that could be applied to teaching through the medium of English, and possibly also, I think the previous question was how to train people to teach through the medium of English. And I think it's very important. And when I do teacher education, and I think you're the same, I think it's very important to kind of get the approach before you get the what do we do part. Because I hope it's clear, and I'd really encourage people to share ideas in week 4. once we've been through the whole journey of from what is EMI to how do we deal with the cultural dynamics of the classroom, at the end of that point, maybe people can make suggestions of what they would do, what resources are really good. We've got plenty of things we can add, perhaps on, should we say, the reflection step. Maybe if we all agree to add some resources there that you think would be useful, we have plenty, as I say. But I think if we put that up front, it's something we wanted to avoid, is to say, this is how you can do it, which in the last run, somebody posted it quite early on, like, here are 50 methods for teaching through English, which was very helpful, but you need a critical eye to go through that and say, okay, why would I use that? How would I do it? Because most methods can fail dismally or be very successful, depending on how you do it, when you do it, and how you prepare students to engage with it. So I think absolutely, I would very much agree with Nina that we want this course to be practical as well as theoretical. But I think that's somewhere where week 4 we can say, right, now we've done everything, what should we do? And that's great. I like the Antonio added the idea, or his experience, that English teachers might be required to learn maths and engineering in order to support EMI lecturers. I had to learn about film studies, but compared to that, I would consider myself quite happy.
I'd rather have a go at film studies than maths, and I think Nina says I studied English to get away from maths. So.
Lots of people do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, good luck, Antonio.
Good luck,
that
Antonio.
happens.
I'm just.
But we do have to learn about what we're supporting to an extent. But yeah, I'd rather have a network of people I'm helping facilitate expertise and communication between, rather than trying to be the expert myself. Yeah, as I said, good luck. You sounded like you were going to say something.
Yes, sorry. Once again, I can't do 2 things at the same time. I'm not very good. Well, in fact, 3 things: listening to Rob, looking at my notes, and reading what's on the screen. I've got a printout of everything that was, all the questions that were put on the step, and I'm just sort of ticking off what we've talked about and what we haven't talked about. One of Anna's questions was, should all students be assessed for their functional level of English as a medium of instruction? I don't think we really talked about that one. And my question back to you is, would you consider formal assessment, informal assessment, or in fact self-assessment? Because lots of these things do come down to practicalities, don't they? If you're like one teacher with 100 students, you can't assess them all unless you've got a really, really quick and dirty test for them, which probably wouldn't be appropriate anyway. Sometimes I've asked students to self-assess, and I've been quite surprised how good they are and honest they are in self-assessing. So that might be an option, that just turn it back onto the students and say, look, do you actually feel good enough to take on this course? Obviously, having been given some information about it and so on. So that might help.
And I thought the interesting thing with that question also was the brackets there, which says i.e. L1 and L2.
Yeah.
So this is a question that comes up quite a lot in relation to our work, because we work with global Englishes a lot. So the idea of language, or the English language internationally being an intercultural language, should, for example, British students be assessed. So if international students who come to Britain are going to be assessed, are you able to do a degree in English? Should English students be assessed as well? Because sometimes their language is lacking in a similar way to students who get rejected. And I think it's very interesting that the assumption the university makes is if you have the academic background and you are English, then they assume that they'll take the risk and say, okay, we assume that you'll be able to do it,
Yeah.
which is not something that many universities will do when people don't speak English as a first language. And I think there's something to be learnt there, the way that assessment is so rigid, so generalized, such a large scale, organized practice for people who don't speak English as a first language. And then the assumption is made that students can just do it if their first language is English. And often students might fail because of their linguistic repertoire. So then they're basically not able to communicate academically effectively. They're not able to write assignments, but we would assume that's because of their academic ability. We wouldn't say we failed a student because their language wasn't really of the right level to perform in this task. So I think the way we treat students is a little bit different there. And again, the solution, I'm not sure. I wouldn't assess everybody. Again, I think there's a danger in this turning to large scale assessment as the answer, but it raises very interesting questions that we treat different people differently who might have the same underlying issues. Sorry, we didn't answer that one either.
Right, but just thinking of practical ways of assessing people, if you really do need to have, you may be forced by your institution to have some form of assessment to, because that's what they want you to do. Asking people to write, and not sort of like what I did for my holiday, but something meaningful in the context of the discipline, is often a good starting point for just seeing what people can put on paper, like the depth of what they're trying to say, as opposed to the linguistic accuracy of what they're saying. So that can be a way, but I do empathise with people who have to, for administrative reasons and so on, sort out who is capable of following a course in English. You might not have the manpower to do it. You may be on your own doing it. So you have sometimes to find quick ways of assessing students. And these are just a few ideas. I don't know if anybody's come up with any those tribes being assessed for that in language support. Or those. Right, yeah. Anna's talking about a trial in Melbourne. Language support assigned to the courses where there was lower levels was required. It comes down to whether course assessment will take place in English. In that case, perhaps a language proficiency requirement should be enforced. Okay, yeah. All students, irrespective of their home language. I like that very much indeed. We seem to be, reinforcing a message here. And there being language support available. So, if you would deem a student, for reasons of language, not able to follow a course, then you have to, provide some support so that perhaps next time round they can take the course. So, so all has to be thought through in the different institutions, and thinking about the people and the knock-on effect if they get refused, to take a course in English. What do they do instead? Do they get another chance? Is there support, etc.?
I think integration is a big part of that as well. I do worry sometimes when I see language support being delivered, and sometimes it's not at all connected with what students are actually doing.
No.
And if not done well, it can be harmful to the students' motivation.
We experience that here, don't we?
We do. We're not. I'm not talking about
with
other
all
places
the
that aren't
language
as good.
support that's provided here. We'd change it if we could. We're not setting ourselves up as some sort of like perfect institution.
No.
At
Exactly,
all.
yeah.
We'd hate to give that impression. But the language support here is by no means what we would want it to be.
Well, it's variable, isn't it? I mean, some areas, where you've got
If you get
integrated
him or
support.
me, you get it's
Exactly.
fine.
Yeah. If you've got, but like my film.
Yes.
No, but you get different areas, and again, what language support means, and also language assessment. It can be very considerate to, because students don't always know whether they can study through English, and sometimes assessing their ability to do so can help them to say, look, you're not quite capable. But in that kind of situation, you really have to be sure that you're saying, no, you're not capable for the right reasons. And that requires a level of expertise.
Yes.
And it can't be done clumsily. I use the word clumsily because I think it happens a lot. But the trouble is that language support, if it has language in, it looks like it's fine. You can make a syllabus and say, I'm teaching, you could almost put anything in there, like passive voice for 7 weeks. And then we're going to finish with past tense. People don't scrutinize that kind of document quite as much as they should. And I do think it really, the language support, the key thing is on the language and the support. It's not just language.
Nature of the support, exactly.
Yeah.
So this is where you have to do a detailed needs analysis of, what the students' perceptions are of what they need. And then perhaps lecturers who are going to be delivering a particular course, their perceptions of what the students they're going to teach should need. Some coming together and some analysis of the needs, so that you don't do the passive for 7 weeks, that you do focus on the chunks of language that are going to be useful for the students, and not just the language, but resources outside of the classroom that students can use, so that it's not all focused on an hour-long class, during which you are given the language you need. No, it's the resources, it's the strategies for learning, dealing with the unknown, etc. So the support, it's a really catch-all phrase, isn't it? And it's so often interpreted as a language syllabus, and it isn't that at all. And it has to be negotiated for the people involved. And then once you deliver it a second time, not to assume that the needs from the first run are the same as the needs of the people in the second run. It has to be an ongoing conversation with the people involved.
And also, your name's just escaped, but it's a good point that we also should question whether the assessment is actually in English or not. Because support could be supporting students to understand lectures, supporting students to read, or supporting students to prepare for assessment. So that's a good point to keep us on track.
Yes, it is. And
context is everything. I'll keep saying that.
I know we do, don't we? I don't think most of my colleagues will be prepared to provide adequate support to lecturers international. There is the assumption that any modern languages graduate with English will do. Yes, we're talking about a sort of worldwide situation. Then any modern language graduate will do.
Yeah. And that's it. I think we have to defend the expertise, and I do talk about. I think we're bringing together large groups of people. And again, the Facebook group is growing, and there are a number of organisations in different places that are dedicated to people teaching through English, or various areas of higher education. And I think a powerful part of that is to defend your territory, if you like, and say, we have to say that there is an expertise. We can't allow universities to treat English support as something that isn't intrinsic to the education of students and can be done badly, can be done well, just like EMI, just like anything else in the university. If you really, as a group, make it clear that we want to say there is an expertise here, this needs to be developed, it can't just be dropped into a university, then with greater numbers, more publications, more awareness, then universities start to listen to things like that and value it more as a kind of a process that can be scrutinized.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point.
And following on from that, last week I did speak about my hope that through this course we can empower you to take control of your local situation and have the dialogues with your universities that Rob has just mentioned, because there is a dynamism within this group that is quite noticeable, and also a willingness and a desire even to succeed. So I'd love to see people in this group, and I think a lot of you are doing it already, actually taking the initiative and leading in EMI, and bearing in mind all the things that we've discussed during the course, and on all the many other things that we need to discuss, because we've only really touched the surface. But it would be lovely to think of people from this course really becoming leaders in EMI. And wouldn't it be wonderful to get together somehow online in years to come and see where we've all got with our local projects and so
And
on.
there were a few questions also about
Oh,
assessment and pedagogy, and something I think would be
Yeah.
very interesting. For example, some people have talked about a lack of genuine communication need.
Mm.
So you've got, for example, people in Mexico with students who all speak Spanish, so there's no real need, imperative to communicate in English in the class. And then people in Brazil who all speak Portuguese, and there's no imperative. What would be very interesting if in future there was some kind of connection,
Yes.
and people in similar disciplines might be able to set up group projects. We've got some very interesting sort of pedagogical and assessment schemes that happen between universities in like engineering, where it's like a competition with mixed teams from different institutions who have to report on what they've done. And I think that would be an interesting and bold move forward.
It would. Anna's suggesting a live streaming occasionally with a specific
I like that idea, yeah.
topic.
Mm.
That is a wonderful idea, Anna.
Yes.
I think we'd be happy to go along with that, wouldn't we?
Absolutely, yeah.
So if
Get some more.
perhaps we can think of a few more ideas, the practicalities of doing this and how to manage it and so on. But that would be a fantastic way of continuing the work that we've done already.
And maybe if we did it regularly, there could be more localization as well, because we're aware different places, even different institutions, but certainly different countries have different considerations. And as somebody said in the comments, we have to keep it quite general when we're bringing together such a large community. But I think the community is also interested in what happens locally in different places.
Yes.
So I think it would give us more opportunity to look into different people's contexts and understand EMI more dynamically.
Yeah. I think Anna has hit upon a really wonderful idea. I'd be interested in all following us on the Facebook group, because obviously this course will come to an end, and then how do we all communicate with one another? I know Facebook isn't everybody's ideal form of communication, but it is a way of keeping together. So perhaps we could have a little discussion over the next week
or maybe comment on the step.
On the step,
because also there are lots of apps that are probably better at dealing with multiple directions of communication. And if anyone's aware of that, not that we are not experts of communication technology, but if you know anything cool and interesting that we could,
you cool guys,
then it would be great to, again, also to, because we can see your comments, but it would be great to be able to stand on an equal platform and have your input and have a proper conversation. I think that would be really interesting.
Oh, and Antonio is sorry he ever left Facebook, a matter of principle.
Good for you. Good principles.
I think we've all got issues with Facebook.
Well, I had a baby, so I had to post 100 baby photos a day.
Yeah.
So I couldn't leave.
No,
but
exactly.
I agree with you in principle.
In principle.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we've kind of come to the end of what we wanted to discuss with you. It's been absolutely brilliant to, what's this, Anna? Your university may be able to help with setting up a webinar.
Absolutely.
Let's see if we can get some funding or something to set up a series of webinars.
I'm sure they could do
Yeah,
that.
let's go for it.
Yes.
Let's go for it. We need to discuss all of these possibilities and then come back to you with a few ideas. And then I hope stay in contact with as many people as possible.
That's it. We can disseminate within the groups.
Yeah.
Somebody tell Antonio what we're going to do,
Yeah.
as he won't hear it on Facebook.
Oh, bless. Okay, shall we say goodbye then?
We could say goodbye.
And see you next week.
Yeah, and thank
on
you
the
for the
recorded.
questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the recorded discussion.
Thank you
so
very much for
Yes.
continuing your enthusiasm. I've been really
Yeah.
happy this week to see sometimes the number of comments and the quality of comments dips, but I think they're getting better. So
The
thank you very
quality
much.
of comments on
been
this run
amazing.
is excellent. You can give yourselves a pat on the back for your commitment and time. And I know how difficult it is for academics to commit to something like this and find the time to do it. So we're very, very, very honoured by this, delighted, honoured, all of those words. It's immensely encouraging for us.
Yes.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. Thank you for people
so much.
who've participated as well, and people who couldn't. Alejandro was upset, but we organised it at the wrong time.
Alejandro said he couldn't.
Is that what
You said Alejandra.
No, I didn't.
Yes, you did.
Oh, it will be recorded. We'll watch it back.
We're going to have to stop before we have an argument. So
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
And what do I
See you
press?
in week 4.
End stream.
End stream. And then end. Let me do it, Mary.